Welcome to the Story Learning Podcast, regular doses of language learning tips and motivation to help you become fluent in any language. With me, Olly Richards. For language programs, books, free resources, and much more, visit StoryLearning.com.
Hello, welcome to the show. It's Olly here. This is the show that you need to listen to propel your language learning up into the stratosphere. If you're learning a new language, you're going to get all the motivation, tips, and tricks you need right here. Now, let's get straight into today's question from Melissa.
Hi, Olly. My name is Melissa, and I am a native English speaker who is learning Spanish for her second language. My question is, when I find people to speak Spanish with, they typically talk back to me in English. I've only been studying for 6 months, so maybe they know that I'm a beginner. How can I convey to them that I want them to speak to me in Spanish, even though I might not understand everything they are saying? I'm not sure if this is the same in other languages, if people are having this problem as well. But thank you.
Okay, Melissa, thank you so much for that question. It's a really important question, and possibly even more important than you might realize, because everybody has this problem when they're learning a foreign language, especially native English speakers. We have lots of advantages in the world from being native speakers of English, but one of the disadvantages we have is that everybody tends to speak English, especially if you're living at home in your English-speaking country. They also will tend to speak English far better than our level in the language that we're learning, as you've identified. And so really the aim for us is to get to a level in our target language where we speak, in your case Spanish, better than they would speak English, because at that point it just becomes obviously much, much easier to do. There's a problem that obviously relates to and happens in all different languages, some languages more than others. I've heard it said quite a lot of times that people learning German have a particular problem because Germans tend to speak English very well, so they won't hesitate to switch into English. And also they seem to have a lower than usual tolerance for people making mistakes in German. That's just what I've heard, because I don't speak German, so please don't take offense, any Germans in the audience. But yeah, I think I'm going to guess that you are in North America and you live there and you are trying to practice Spanish with Spanish speakers who you meet when you're out and about. Again, I'm just going to have to read between the lines there because you didn't mention that, but that would be the typical thing, because there are lots of Spanish-speaking people around and you've got, on the face of it, lots of opportunities to practice, right? Well, here's the thing. If you're meeting people when you're out and about in shops, on the street, for me, I find that an incredibly difficult way to get practice in a language. Because you've got this issue of having to perform then and there. As soon as you start speaking to someone, you're judged right away on your level. If you speak with lots of confidence, that's one thing. If you speak with not very much confidence, which it sounds like it might be the case for you at the moment, Melissa, then, the tendency is straight away to switch back into English. But here's the thing, you shouldn't assume, and this is where it gets complex, you should not assume that just because they go back into English, it's a poor reflection on your Spanish. That is not necessarily the case. There are lots and lots of reasons why someone might want to reply to you in English, and the social pressure that immigrants feel in the country that they're living can be so great that they will do whatever they can to kind of prove to people that actually they do belong here and they do speak English. And if you go up to let's just say Spanish, because that's the topic. If you go up to a Spanish person and maybe they've recently arrived in the States, or again, I'm just assuming you're in the States, and you speak to them in Spanish, it's important to think, well, what kind of stigma might they be feeling that might make them feel awkward for you to speak to them in Spanish? Maybe they think, well, oh, look, this person's talking to me and she thinks I don't speak English, but I do, and so I want to prove that to them. So there are all kinds of very complex reasons why people would react that way. And I certainly remember, for me, when I was in Japan in particular, I used to hate it when people used to come up to me and talk to me in English on the street, because I would react like, well, what are you doing? I speak Japanese. Talk to me in Japanese. And I hated this kind of stigma of being a foreigner in Japan. And I would reply in English, but very begrudgingly, So it's complex, and it's not so straightforward. If you really, do want to get practice out and about, and I think it's great that you do, and it's great that you've got the sort of willingness and the las ganas de hacerlo, the energy to do it. I think really in that situation, the best thing to do is simply to ask them. You could do something like learn a specific set phrase in Spanish that says, I really love your language and I'd like to practice it, or some words to that effect. And if you do that, the chances are that they'd have to be really, really stubborn not to do it at that point. So you could do that. You could learn a phrase that basically says, look, I'm learning your language. I really, really like it. I'd love to practice. You could try that. Alternatively, what sometimes happens is that if you actually persist, and so you say something in Spanish, they reply in English. If you then said something else in Spanish again, kind of making your intent clear, oftentimes they would then switch into Spanish. But, this whole thing, I find it personally really, really uncomfortable. It's like this kind of social standoff that I just don't like to get into. So I would say don't let this thing of having to speak Spanish with strangers on the street as being your benchmark. Don't think that, you should judge yourself and your level by that alone, because it's just not realistic. What you need to do is to create a different, separate framework for your language practice. And the best way to do this is to find someone, either a tutor or a language exchange partner, someone who you can meet with regularly and practice regularly with in a safe, comfortable environment where you don't have to sort of stress about them replying in English and prove this and that. And by doing that, if you can find someone that you can meet with regularly and practice, set time, maybe 1 hour, 2 or 3 times a week, you can learn Spanish and you can improve on your own terms. And it's so important to do that because language requires deliberate practice over a long period of time. And the more that you put yourself in this kind of social juggling act, the more difficult you're going to find it, and you might experience a kind of a loss in motivation as well, and it can be really, really damaging. Now, if you find that if I've misunderstood your question and you do have Spanish speaking partners and they always reply to you in English, well, this is a simpler case, all right? And in that case, I would simply, before your next session, before you next meet them, I would sit them down and tell them exactly what you've told me. Say, look, I'm finding that I really want to practice Spanish, but everybody seems to reply in English to me, but I really need to get some practice. I really need to practice more. So I'd like to use our sessions, our time together, to speak only in Spanish. What do you think? Would that be okay? You might like to do something, let's say you have a language exchange partner, you might like to divide the time equally, so you do half an hour only in Spanish and half an hour only in English. I wouldn't mess around with this kind of situation where one person speaks in Spanish and the other person replies in English. That's not helpful. Have some designated time when you just speak in Spanish. Now, if you find the person, you might find that they still keep slipping into English. And if that's the case, and it's happened to me lots of times before, it may be the case that it's time to move on. It's time to find different people. There are lots of places out there to find language exchange partners, both online and face-to-face. I tend to do a mixture of both, but the point is that you shouldn't be restricted to spending your practice time with someone who is only replying to you in English. So I would ask them very just straightforwardly, say, look, I want to practice Spanish more. Can we have a half an hour or 1 hour only in Spanish? And then just tell them. If they don't like it, well, time to move on and find someone else. So, Melissa, I hope that's helpful. I know how hard it is, and I can kind of hear in your voice how frustrated you are. And I kind of want to reach out through the airwaves and just kind of give you a big hug because I know how tough that is. But if you follow the suggestions that I've given here, hopefully that should remove all of that kind of social lottery and give you a safe framework where you can practice consistently. If you'd like to ask me a question, please go to iwillteachyoualanguage.com/ask and you'll be able to do it right there. You can also do it in an iTunes review. So you can go to iwillteachyoualanguage.com/review and that will take you to the place where you can do that and ask me a question. I'd also like to leave you with a resource on the topic of the show, and you're going to like this because I actually wrote a big long post on the blog some time ago, a few months ago, And the title of the post was How to Stop People Speaking to You in English, or How to Stop People Replying to You in English. I actually went out and asked a whole bunch of language learners, travelers, people very experienced in this field for their personal take, and I got loads of fantastic replies from people about how they deal with this situation. So I want everybody listening to this to go over and check that out right now, because it's going to really give you a different perspective. You can find a link to that post in the show notes, which will be at iwillteachyoualanguage.com/episode 37. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode of the podcast.
Thanks for listening to today's episode, and in case you didn't already know, I teach languages in a rather unusual way through stories. Now, stories are a great way to learn a new language because when you're engrossed in a story, you remember things more easily, and the mechanics of the language just start clicking inside your brain. It's quite something, and if you'd like to find out how you can learn a new language or improve your skills in a language that you already know and do it with the power of stories, then you should check out my free Story Learning Kit, which will teach you exactly how this method works and how you can use it yourself to learn a new language. Visit storylearning.com/podkit, that's PODKIT, to get free access. Inside you'll find explanatory videos, masterclasses, worksheets, short stories to practice with, and much more. Once again, that is storylearning.com/podkit, PODKIT, and if you're lucky, you might also find a link in the podcast description or show notes of this episode.